at COD. We are very happy to have Sam Weller here. Sam Weller is an acclaimed writer, Ray Bradbury's biographer. He has published 3 books of nonfiction on Bradbury, 1 anthology of fiction, which was honored with the Bram Stoker Award. He also writes for NPR, for Publishers Weekly, for Slate, for Chicago Dailies. He is a prolific writer, and we are honored to have him. I would also like to add that I've been looking at Whitman again, at Leaves of Grass, only as a prompt from one of the interviews in one of Sam's books. And I noticed that Whitman talked about duplicates and how people are duplicates of each other. And I see that in Sam. I see Ray's duplicate in Sam. And I can understand why he used the title, Listen to the Echoes, because really we have an echo of Bradbury in Sam Weller's work. So we are honored, to say the least, to have Sam Weller here. Thank you for being here with us. Sam.
All right. Good evening. Thank you all for coming out tonight. And some repeat customers from this afternoon. I will try to keep things interesting and different for those of you who are concerned about, a repeat performance from my talk at this very podium at noon. I will try to differ it a little bit tonight. But thank you all for joining us on this evening where the sheets are covered in a sheen of ice to listen to me talk about something I'm very passionate about. As Trina stated, my dedication to the life and works of Ray Bradbury. I want to thank Trina for inviting me to the College of DuPage. Our dialogue started about a year ago to have me come out, and that incredibly gracious introduction. I do a lot of talks around the country about Mr. Bradbury, his life and works, and my own writing and publishing and just the creative process in general. That was a very heartfelt and moving introduction, so thank you very much. Been sort of dazzled by this place in the quick time I've been here. It's an inspiring institution, so thanks for welcoming me. I guess I'd preface things tonight. As Trina said, it is important to me to feel a bit like I'm an echo of Ray Bradbury. I want to share with you a little bit of how I came into Mr. Bradbury's life, how I became his biographer, and I think most saliently what I learned from him about creative writing, about creativity, about life. He was a deeply philosophical man with a lot of wisdom. And so I want to channel that a bit tonight and bring him here, as I often say, to channel him and bring him here to a degree. He passed away June 5th, 2012, just on the edge of turning 92. So he lived a glorious and accomplished life. But he often told a story that I want to begin with tonight that talked about seeking immortality. And immortality was a theme that was very central to much of his canon, sort of the concept of living forever. When he was 12 years old, and this is a story that if he were here tonight, I promise you he would tell. And so I will begin tonight by sharing this story with all of you, because if Mr. Bradbury were here, this is how he would begin his talk. When he was 12 years old, he lived in Waukegan, Illinois, not all that far from here, on the shoreline of Lake Michigan. He was born August 22nd, 1920 at 4:50 in the afternoon. He missed 4:51 by just a minute, so it was kind of I have to pay you for your laughter. It's terrific, thank you. His father was a out-of-work utility line worker. The family struggled to put food on the table, but yet Ray Bradbury came to be somehow, and that's something that's been very important to me to sort of chart and explain how Ray Bradbury became Ray Bradbury. But when he was 12, one of those sort of seminal moments, one of those moments that shaped him, he had fallen in love with many things as a child. Edgar Allan Poe, L. Frank Baum, H.G. Wells, Sir Lewis Carroll, the films of Lon Chaney like The Hunchback of Notre Dame, The Phantom of the Opera. He would go to the old movie theaters in Waukegan, the Genesee, which has now been restored to its former grandeur. He went there as a child frequently and saw Blackstone the Magician perform on stage, saw films there. He was really a child of popular culture and very much shaped by cinema, and I think that impacted his sense of narrative. There's a visual quality to Mr. Bradbury's writing that I think is a reflection of his love of film. His concepts The concepts of his stories are very memorable, very highly conceptual, and I think that that's an indication of his love of movies. But he also loved circuses and carnivals. And for those of you who have read his work, you're fully aware of the book that many scholars consider to be his classic. And that's the 1962 novel, Something Wicked This Way Comes, which if you want to read a great October book leading up to Halloween, Something Wicked This Way Comes is a fantastic book that captures autumn in all of its mystery and wonder. And the book centers around the concept of a malevolent dark carnival arriving in Greentown, Illinois, long after midnight in an evening in the 1920s. And the carnival unloads off the train and sets up, and it's run by a man named Mr. Dark, who is there to steal the souls of the townspeople. And two children they discover the carnival's intentions and endeavor to bring it down. Well, Mr. Bradbury as a child loved circuses and carnivals, and when he was 12, on Labor Day weekend, there was a carnival that had set up its tents on the shorelines of Lake Michigan. And this is the story he would tell all of you. He walked down the hill towards the lake and went into the carnival and found a dusty tent, and it said, "Live, Mr. Electrico," on a sign outside. And he went in, and he sat on an old sawdust floor, 12 years old, bespectacled, and sat on the floor in the front row. And a man came out in a velvet cape with an assistant, and there was an electric chair on the stage, one of those old wooden and bolt electric chairs. And the assistant strapped the man in with shackles on the wrists and put the contraption over his head and laid a large Excalibur sword next to the chair. And the assistant walked off, Ray Bradbury and a bunch of children staring on, watching, as the assistant pulled the lever, and Mr. Electrico was charged with, as Bradbury recalled, 50,000 volts of raw electricity, and he rattled, and he he shook, and his eyes started to glow, and as the assistant removed the contraption over his head, his hair rose on end, and his teeth glowed. And she unshackled him, and he stood up, and he grabbed the Excalibur sword and walked to the front row and started to tap the children sitting there, cross-legged on the floor, tapping them on the shoulders. And they could feel the voltaic power coming through the Excalibur sword into them. And the hair on their arms and the hair on their neck and the hair on their head would rise. And they could feel the charge from him. And he came all the way down to the end to young Ray Bradbury. And he tapped him on the left shoulder, and he tapped him on the right. And then he tapped him on the tip of his nose with the tip of the sword and cried, "Live forever." And Bradbury was filled with wonder and thought, why did he say that? He hadn't said it to any of the other kids. Why did he say that? And when he walked home, he recalled hearing the carousel playing Beautiful Ohio, and walked home in a misty rain and thought, how do you live forever? 2 weeks later, Ray Bradbury wrote his first short story. And today, here at the College of DuPage, we're talking about him. I travel the country talking about him. I have written 3 books and edited an anthology dedicated to him. He is gone, but there is an asteroid named for him. There is a region of Mars named for him. There is a crater on the moon named for him. There is a square outside of Central Library in Los Angeles named for him. He lives forever. And so Mr. Electrico, in many ways, was right. That's the story he would begin with tonight. So I hope to bring him here a bit, but I thought I'd backtrack before I get into some of my own writing, and Trina asked me to share some of my own fictions. It was important to Mr. Bradbury that I carry on his tradition, and that was always, to be really honest with you, sort of my intentions. As our relationship continued to grow. I met him, I guess, as I said earlier today, in utero. And Bradbury always thought that sounded like a Ray Bradbury story. My father read Bradbury to my mom when she was pregnant with me, and he would read his books aloud to her. And I was 8-9 months in utero, and my dad read The Illustrated Man, which is a frightening short story collection about a carnival freak whose body is covered in skin illustrations. And each tattoo is one of the stories in the book. Why a father would choose to read that to a pregnant woman still perplexes me. When I ask my dad, almost 82, he laughs. But there's stories of children listening to Brahms or Beethoven or Bach and it having an effect on their brain development. Hasn't been proven, but that's been posited. Well, I can't speak to the classical composers, but I can speak to Bradbury as his biographer that something happened in the womb, because I'm here with you all 48 years later as his authorized biographer. I grew up and I read The Illustrated Man myself, and I fell in love with the ideas. I think they're wildly imaginative, they're wildly original, but mostly, interestingly, as an 11-year-old child, I fell in love with the prose. I think the language is poetic and lyrical and musical and melancholy and connected with a young reader on the precipice of adolescence. And I think in many ways, I often say that I think Ray Bradbury is one of our finest gateway authors from young adult fiction over to the more foreboding moors, if you will, of sort of challenging literature. Bradbury writes about things that appeal to young readers, but he studied Steinbeck and Willa Cather and Eudora Welty and Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald and Shakespeare and Dickens and Melville and Poe, and studied the great literary writers of the centuries, and took everything he learned from that over to genre fiction. And I think you can't name that many genre writers, quote unquote genre writers, who have been able to traverse the bridge over to literary acceptance. And Bradbury certainly, along with Poe and some others, is in select company in that. So I fell in love with his work. I became a writer because of his work. I remember a book under our Christmas tree when I was a child that my dad wrote in it, "To the next Ray Bradbury, perhaps even better." And I was a young child, and to one day have Ray Bradbury sign that book under my dad's signature was a profound arrival. And he laughed. He said, "Good luck, kid." But he said, I want you to carry on my tradition. You have studied under me. He really, in many ways, and this I mean this with great reverence, he became sort of my Yoda. The man had suffered 2 strokes. He used a walker, but he was filled with profound life wisdom. And I had 12 years of that from this guy. When we talk about his accomplishments, people think about Fahrenheit 451, the Martian Chronicles, Dandelion Wine, Something Wicked This Way Comes, but he also wrote for The Twilight Zone and for Alfred Hitchcock Presents. He designed shopping plazas around the world. He designed Spaceship Earth at Epcot Center. He had his own theatrical company in Los Angeles. His contributions to popular culture are just dizzying. All without a college degree, self-educated in the public library, just from reading and writing, and butt in the chair. There's a lot to learn in that for the creatives in the room. He was the original poster boy for the Nike mantra of just do it. In fact, as I said today in my talk, the quote that I chose to begin my first book on, the first quote on the first page is his life mantra, and I think it's worth repeating. It's jump off the cliff and build your wings on the way down. And that represents his approach to life. So I was writing as a journalist in the late 90s and 2000 for various publications, and I was writing for the Chicago Tribune at that time, and I knew that this very famous Illinois literary native son was turning 80, and what better time to do a profile of him for the Tribune, Chicago Tribune Sunday magazine. And so I pitched it to my editor, and she said, "Where does he live?" And I said, "Well, he's been in Los Angeles since the age of 13. And she said, "Go, great idea." And to my delight, I walked in the front door a few weeks later of Ray Bradbury's house and sat down, and what I thought would be a 1-hour interview turned into a 6-hour interview. And when we were complete, he said, "I'd like you to come back." And so I knew that something was beginning there, and we started to write letters and fax one another, and he would send me things in the mail, and I continued to go visit him and have lunch. And this relationship started, and I knew full well that there was not a biography of him that charted this life fantastic. You had to piece his life together from various introductions and forwards to books. And I asked him, "Why is there no biography of you?" And he said, very simply put, biography means you're dead. He said, "So I'm 80. He said, "Do me a favor." He said, "If this is something you want to do, and I think you'd be good at it, call me in 30 or 35 years, and we'll get working on it." To some degree, I think he believed Mr. Electrico literally. But I knew that there was an in, and he kept asking me to come back and visit, and to bring my tape recorder and bring my pencil and my notebook and take notes. And I did just that, and about 5 months later, he turned to me and he said, I've had a complete change of heart. Everything in my life comes from intuition and passion. And you are passionate about my life's work. You've read everything. You're interested in everything I've done. I want you to write this book. Someone who writes this book should be fascinated by the subject, and you are fascinated. And so from that point forward, I was given the huge responsibility of chronicling at that point an 80-year life in between two covers. And it wasn't an easy process. But as I said, I learned an awful lot along the way. And I knew as it went on, what started as a magazine story became a biography, and then I thought I was done. And a publisher came to me and said, how much material in your research did you use in the biography? And I said, maybe 10%. And they said, well, where's the other 90? And I said, in my files. And they said, would you like to do a book of just your conversations with Mr. Bradbury? And that came out in 2010. It's called Listen to the Echoes, the Ray Bradbury Interviews, and it's just the two of us talking about faith and politics and Hollywood and creativity. That book was an absolute labor of love. I thought at that point I am done, and I'm moving on to other things. I knew that with an MFA in fiction writing, and I teach partially in a fiction program and a nonfiction program, it was time to move into working more on my own fiction and a novel. But Bradbury continues to come back, and it always will for the rest of my life. And a colleague of mine at Columbia College proposed the idea of Shadow Show, this anthology. And his metaphor was simple. He said, there are a lot of bands and musical artists out there where there's tribute albums in honor of them, where other artists record the songs of Hank Williams or to the Rolling Stones. Why not do a tribute anthology in honor of Ray Bradbury? And so I thought about it, and I thought, well, part of me wants to move on. Bradbury really wanted me to carry forward into doing fantastic fiction in his tradition. And I'd learned so much from him, I felt it was the time to move forward. So I was slightly hesitant. But then I thought, well, this is a move into fiction more, and it's a book. And it's something that I think was a very original idea. And so I agreed to do this. And that day that I agreed to do it, I met with Mort Castle, who's 9 times been nominated for the Bram Stoker Award. And he co-edited this book with me. And we sat down in a Starbucks over a venti latte. I swore I would never use venti grande and tall, and here I am doing it. We sat down over coffee and made a wish list of writers who, over the course of their careers, had said, Ray Bradbury influenced me. And then we thought, okay, who can you contact and who can I contact? And a couple days later, I was at the park with my children, and on my phone, sent a message on Twitter to Neil Gaiman and said, I'm doing, in 140 characters, that's all I had to pitch Neil Gaiman, Newbery Award-winning writer, author of Coraline, a book of short stories that is presently on the New York Times bestseller list, which says hooray for short stories that they're selling because of writers like Neil Gaiman. And I sent him a message on Twitter and said, doing an anthology in honor of Ray Bradbury, hoping for an original story, would love to include you. Within 10 minutes, I'm still at the park and it says I'm in. So, well, my luck's going, why not try Margaret Atwood, try Dave Eggers, and everybody easily fell into line. Everybody. And so the book was sort of a joy to curate and put together and work with this all-star cast of writers. I thought at that point, it's now time to move into my short stories. I have a collection of short stories that's finished. All stories that I think very much hail from Bradbury's milieu of October Country. It's a milieu of Gothic American, Midwestern American fiction. And that story collection is finished. But my publisher, one of my publishers, Melville House, has this series called The Last Interview, which literally are the last interviews with iconic writers who have left us. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, James Baldwin. And they asked, did you do the last interview with Ray Bradbury? And I did. And so they said, would you be interested in publishing that in our series? And it's a short book. It's a very slight book, but these literally are the last 4 interviews, 4 conversations that I did with him. And the last interview in the book literally is the last interview he ever did. It was conducted on April 11th and April 12th of 2012, less than 2 months before he passed away. And maybe I'll read one section of this, and I'm going to read a portion of my story from Shadow Show this evening as well. But I thought I would read the beginning of the last interview. And he was infirmed in a bed pretty much for the last year and a half of his life, with a brilliant mind and a body that was withering. And it was very hard to watch and caused me to ponder, is it easier to lose one's mind and have a sound body, or is it easier to keep your mind completely intact and be imprisoned? I guess the answer is neither one is advantageous and fun. They're terrible. So it was very difficult to see him at home, but his spirit was still undaunted. He was still optimistic and happy to have days. And so I'll just read the very beginning of this interview. Just two questions. I ask, we've spent a lot of time together over these years, Ray. And he says, it's been magnificent, hasn't it? I say, yes, it has. It's been amazing. I'm more interested in your life and work than ever before. I still marvel at the idea that as a child growing up in Waukegan, Illinois, you knew veterans of the Civil War. As the poet of the space age, the Ray Bradbury the world knew, you associated with the veterans of the Mercury and Apollo space programs. You have lived and participated in an unprecedented era of progress. Looking back on it all, does it seem like life went by quickly, or was it slow? He says, it was just right. Perfect, in fact. I wouldn't change a thing. And I ask, can I ask you a difficult question? Of course. Are you afraid to die? I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of not living. Those are the words of Bradbury. This is a story in Shadow Show that I wrote that was deeply, deeply influenced by the concept of Bradbury. And I read this story to him while he was in that same bed. He would often ask me to come and read to him. And I can't tell you what an absolutely profound experience it is to sit with someone who literally has been with you your whole life and to have them say, will you read to me? I mean, just saying that, it makes me want to cry. And to have the experience of him say, will you read to me? And because his eyesight was gone, I mean, he couldn't see much. I'd say, I'd love to read to you, Ray. What would you like me to read? And he had a little smile on his face, and he said, how about Bradbury? And I said, well, what would you like me to read, Ray? And he said, there's a paragraph in a story called The Foghorn. And I went down to his living room, where all of his books were on a beautiful built-in case, and picked up a copy of The Golden Apples of the Sun, a great short story collection from 1953, and read The Foghorn by Ray Bradbury to Ray Bradbury. I was crying, and he was crying. And he said, I said, Ray, why are you crying? He cried at everything. Let me preface that. I mean, he cried when he had a good hamburger. He was a very sensitive individual. He loved life. He loved Merlot. He loved banana cream pie. He loved vanilla ice cream with chocolate sauce. He loved steak. He lived pretty hardcore for 92 years and didn't watch much of anything, in terms of his health or his dietary. So he had good Swedish genes because he lived the way he wanted to live. Didn't do a lot of exercise. He resisted it because his brother was a jock, and so he rebelled against that. So he cried at a lot of things, but I said, Ray, why are you crying at The Foghorn? And he said, because I can't believe I wrote that. That seems like someone else wrote that. And I don't have a copy of The Golden Apples of the Sun tonight. I wish I did, because the paragraph in there I'm speaking of is arguably the finest paragraph he ever wrote. I would go out on that limb. And we're talking 600 published short stories, essays, and poems, novels, screenplays, and everything I mentioned earlier. It's remarkable. And it's about the origins of the sound of the foghorn, calling out into the rags of mist out to sea to warn the ships of the coastline. And it's almost biblical in its point of view, in its authority, in its voice. It's just absolutely gorgeous. And he was sending his books at that time to John Huston, the great film director, simply because he loved John Huston. Ray Bradbury was the original fanboy. He went to comic book conventions before they were called comic book conventions, and hounded celebrities outside the gates of Paramount Studios asking for autographs. My books have pictures of George Burns standing with Ray Bradbury when Bradbury was 14, Marlene Dietrich standing with Ray Bradbury. He was so gutsy, he chased Dietrich up the stairs of a beauty salon trying to get her autograph. And it was written up in the Los Angeles Times. Ardent fan chases Dietrich up staircase. Little did anybody know that the ardent fan would become one of the great writers of the 20th century. So he was this, glorious fanboy. And so to sit with him and read The Foghorn, knowing he had sent as a fanboy his book to John Huston, saying, Mr. Huston, I love your work. Huston was the Scorsese of the 40s and 50s, one of the great American movie mavericks. Bradbury just fearlessly leaping from cliffs and building wings and sending books to Huston saying, I want to write a screenplay with you. I don't know you. I've never written a screenplay. I want to write a screenplay for you. And Huston calls him the week Bradbury finishes his magnum opus, Fahrenheit 451, and says, meet me at the Beverly Hills Hotel, have a martini with me, and I have an offer. And he offered him the screenplay to, of all books, Moby Dick. Bradbury's response was, gee, Mr. Huston, I'd love to write the screenplay to Moby Dick, but I've never been able to read the damn book. 600 and how many pages, Trina? 80? Like most American readers, he had not read the book. And Huston said, of course, well, go home tonight, read Moby Dick, and call me in the morning. And tell me if you'd like to go to Ireland with me and help me kill the white whale. And Bradbury went home that night and told his wife, pray for me. And she said, what now? And he said, because I have to read a book tonight and do a book report by morning. And he read a part of Moby Dick and fell in love with it. The Shakespeare, the Bible, the allegory, the metaphor, the language, the poetry, Melville. And he called Huston and said, I'm in. Jumped off the cliff and built wings. Why did Huston call Ray Bradbury? Because he had read The Foghorn and read the paragraph that I had read to Bradbury in his bed. He had read that paragraph and said, I smell a scent of Melville, and hired Ray Bradbury to write that screenplay. So if you have a moment to dig that story out, I will tell you, Bradbury hated the internet, thought it was a tremendous waste of babble, it's a distraction, and despite all of its research applications, he thought it was too much blah, blah, blah. That's how he described it. Get off and go talk to your loved ones. Quit sending them a message and give them a message face to face. I came to him with this story and said to him, he's lying in bed, and I said, I've written this story and I'd like to read it to you. And he said, okay. And I read this story called The Girl in the Funeral Parlor, and when I looked up, he was weeping. And I said, why are you crying now, Ray? And he said, because you've written a Bradbury story. It's high praise. And so the reason Trina asked me to read from some of my own fiction, I have a novel that I vowed to finish by December, and it's very Bradburian. I mean, it's a love story set through time, and it's very existential. It's about fate. And this story is very much about fate. It's deeply influenced by a Bradbury story in Dandelion Wine, which if you haven't read Dandelion Wine, it's a semi-autobiographical collection of short stories that are all tied together about growing up in Illinois in the 1920s. And there's not an element of science fiction, but he uses all the tropes of science fiction and fantasy and the devices of it. So for example, a story about a time machine is not about a time machine. It's about an old man who can tell stories. He uses all the devices of the fantastic and magical realism and science fiction, but uses those metaphorically to tell a real-life story about coming of age and coming to grips with our own mortality when we're children. And when we have that epiphanal moment of one day I too will die. That's what Dandelion Wine is about. And there's a story in there called The Swan. And it's much, it's a much lesser known story than most of the Bradbury classics. There Will Come Soft Rains, The Veldt, Mars is Heaven, and on and on. This Kaleidoscope, stories that Bradbury's known for. The Swan isn't always noted, but I would argue that it's possibly one of the finest Bradbury stories ever written. In fact, I teach the only college level class on the life and works on Ray Bradbury in the country. And at the end of that class, we read about 45 short stories, and I always survey the students. Okay, I want a poll of what is your favorite story. And 2 years in a row, out of the 45 stories, this story, The Swan, has come up as their favorite. And it's a deep favorite of mine. It's about soulmates and missed connections, and I wanted to take that theme and address it through my own voice and my own ideas and my own experience. And as I said today, something I learned from Bradbury that I know we have a lot of writers in the room and people who are great readers and interested in writing. I think one of the important things of many things I learned from Ray Bradbury was that great fantasy, particularly, must come from a point of truth and from a point of our own emotional experience. So when Bradbury wrote a story of the fantastic, very often it came from something, an epiphanal experience in his own days. It was something that profoundly shaped him as a person. And he re-examined it through the experience and the prism of the fantastic. And so I wanted to utilize that motif, if you will, with my own story. And I was thinking about The Swan. I knew that in Shadow Show we had a range of stories. There are carnival stories, there are ghost stories, there are science fiction stories. And I thought, what is sort of missing from this collection at this point to round out the breadth and wonder that encapsulates all that Ray Bradbury accomplished in his writing career? And one of them I thought was more of a story of Midwest Gothic, a story of lost love and missed connections, and it made me think of The Swan. And then I told myself, well, I want to write something that comes from my own truth. I didn't want to write a story in here that was derivative of Bradbury. I wanted to write a story that is reflective of my voice, because my voice is different than Bradbury's, and reflected my experience, but in ways that are obvious or deeply influenced by him. And I thought back to my own, what experiences were profound that I haven't addressed essayistically or through fiction. And one of them was a story that I thought about when I was 19 years old and a freshman in college. I delivered flowers for a living in far, far western Illinois, out in the sticks and the farm fields. And I would drive to these houses on cold, barren winter nights up long driveways and knock on doors and wonder if I'd be alive the next day if somebody called me into their house. I didn't know. Knocking on doors in the night, after the sun set at 4 in the afternoon in January. And I would deliver these flowers, but often on Saturday mornings, the floral company would have me go into funeral homes and set up floral arrangements in funeral parlors, in these grand old Victorian mansions, beautiful mansions, old 1800s family homes that had been turned into funeral parlors. And I would go into these huge living room kind of areas with open caskets and the chairs all there, but nobody had arrived yet. The funeral service was still 2 or 3 hours away. And I would come in through the back door with these giant casket sprays that you'd lay out on the closed portion of the casket, or huge arrangements in my arms. And I always knew better through respect to the deceased. Most of the caskets were open, and I often resisted, respectfully, I didn't know these people, set the flowers up and leave. But one day I walked in and set up a casket spray on the lower half of a coffin, of a casket, the closed half, almost like a magician's box, if you will, where half of it is closed and half is open. And set this flower up, and through the corner of my eye, I saw this gleaming sheen of hair, long hair, and I was just magnetically, for the first time, coaxed into looking. And I turned, and in that casket was a young woman, late 20s, early 30s at most, with her arms crossed and an infant in her arms. And I left, I retreated to my van, and I closed the door, and I started to cry. I mean, as you said, I'm the echo of Ray Bradbury. I mean, I don't cry at burgers, but I definitely cried that day. I wept. I've never forgotten that. I've never forgotten the curl of that child in that woman's arms on her chest. We'll never forget it. And that, when I thought about it, was the experience that I said, I need to write about that fictitiously. I need to address that pain. I need to exercise that sorrow. And so my story in Shadow Show is called The Girl in the Funeral Parlor. And it's based on me, but this flower delivery boy is not me. He goes to a community college in Western Illinois. Not COD, but something similar. He's studying English literature. He wants to be a writer. He goes to a funeral parlor and turns and looks and doesn't see a woman with a child because I thought that was just too much. He sees a woman with blonde hair and beautiful eyeliner with little points at the end. And he realizes then and there, looking at this woman in the casket, that this is his soulmate. He has an absolute 110% realization that this is the person he was meant to be with for the rest of his life. Yet, of course, there's the caveat that she's gone. Gone forever. And so the premise of it, the metaphor of it is, what happens if you meet the person you're meant to be with after they're deceased? And so he sees her and he goes home and continues to think about her and starts to Google who she was through her obituary and do research on her, and he becomes sort of obsessed. One of the motifs in Bradbury's fiction is obsessed characters. And he becomes obsessed with her, and he discovers that her mother's name is listed in the obituary, and she lives out in a mobile trailer park on the edge of town, and he decides to go visit her. And I thought I would read from that. The Fontainebleau Mobile Home Park sign was faded, and paint was chipping off at the bottom. As I pulled in, a kid ran across the street, chasing a ball. I slammed on the brakes, the van lurching, barely missing him. He was maybe 7 or 8, with a crew cut and plenty of freckles. He glared at me. "Sorry," I mouthed, and waved. In the side view mirror, I could see him as I pulled the van forward, standing with his ball, mouth pinched, scowling. The mobile homes of Fontainebleau were so run down, they looked like haunted trailers, with plywood planking and stained bed sheets over the windows. But some had jaunty flower gardens and new shiny mailboxes in front. I found Candace Currington's mobile home at the end of the street. A Doberman chained to the neighboring mobile home barked, baring its teeth. Across the street, a man working over the engine of an El Camino looked up at me. I nodded. He didn't say a word or nod back. He wiped sweat from his brow. Along the walkway leading to the mobile home, plastic flowers spun in the wind. The windows had dusty metal horizontal blinds turned shut. I stepped up to the door and knocked. The guy across the street wiped his oily hands on a towel and watched me. The dog continued to bark, straining against its leash. The door opened just a bit. The woman held a lit cigarette in her hand. She had a dome of swimming pool blonde hair and tired eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Candace Currington?" "Yes," she said, looking over my shoulder to the van parked on the street. "Flower delivery," I said, extending the arrangement in my arms. She took it. The flower delivery guy brought a dummy arrangement that he just took with to bring to her. "Thanks." Her cigarette dangled from her lips. She began to close the door. "I knew your daughter," I blurted, my words running together before she could shut the door. "Oh, yeah? I'm so sorry." "Thanks," she said. "How did you know her?" "High school," I thought, about Sir Walter Scott's old quote about webs and deception. "You went to school in New York?" she asked. "What are you doing out here in Sterling Springs?" The lies were building. "This is actually where I grew up. My parents just moved there for a few years, and that's how I met Catherine." I had no clue where this was going. "That's so," she said. "The flowers are for me." I tried to smile. Candace Currington looked at the arrangement. "That's nice of you." She stepped back to close the door. I knew this was my only chance. Can I tell you a story about Catherine, Mrs. Currington? A story from our days in New York? Jesus. She stared at me for a moment, thoughtfully. Sure, she said at last. Come in. You want a glass of water? If you don't mind. The mobile home was dark, and piles of bills were stacked on end tables alongside prescription pill bottles. The TV was on, and a woman on the screen was sobbing. We sat in the living room on a saggy sofa with the plaid cloth worn thin on the edges. A framed print of that impressionist painting by Seurat, Sunday in the Park, or whatever it's called, hung slightly crooked over us. It's weird that all the people in that painting, all the well-dressed women with their parasols, and the men with their top hats, and the dogs, and the kids, and even the monkey, are all facing the lake or away in another direction, but not the little girl. That kid with her white dress and bonnet, right in the middle of that painting, is looking right at you. Candace Currington fetched me a glass of water from the kitchen. On a coffee table was a magazine, Modern Amputee. I picked it up and looked at the attractive blonde posing on the cover. She wore a prosthetic leg. I thumbed through some unopened envelopes next to the magazine. One was addressed to Catherine Currington, 210 East 5th Street, New York, New York. A phone bill. I folded it and put it in my back pocket. I felt like a douchebag, but kept it anyway. What's your name? Asked Catherine Currington, returning to the room and handing me the glass of water. I'm Josh Diebold. What do you do, Josh, besides deliver flowers? She sat down next to me. We were both sunk so low it felt like we were sitting on the floor. I'm studying English Lit at Rock River College. Well, ended at that. His web of deception continues as he sits there and steals the phone bill so he can figure out the mystery of who Catherine Currington was and how she died and who this soulmate of his was. The story is in its entirety in Shadow Show, along with 25 other stories by Neil Gaiman and Joe Hill, the son of Stephen King, and Dave Eggers and Kelly Link and Charles Yu and Bonnie Jo Campbell, and it's just was an absolute joy to curate this book and edit this book and put this book together. You can tell that that is not Ray Bradbury. In fact, I bristled when I just read that the one word that I just read to you. Bradbury rarely ever used profanity in his stories. And I asked him, why do you not use profanity? And he says, because I love it too much in real life. But he also said that profanity is perishable and kind of cheapens your fiction. And Bradbury, I think, was in the same mindset with Truman Capote when he set out to write In Cold Blood. Capote said that in order to write something truly timeless, we have to write about subject matter that is truly timeless. And so he chose the subject, sadly, graphically, violently, of murder when he addressed In Cold Blood, because murder has vexed us as a species since we began. And I think Bradbury, Capote and Bradbury being mindful of living forever and the timeless quality of their work. And as I've studied other writers, there seems to be an awareness of how their work will last long after they're gone. And so as I conclude here and move to questions, he kept his mind and his eye squarely on the concept of his work staying on this planet long after he departed. And he died now almost 3 years ago, but on what would have been his 92nd birthday, 2 months after his death, the Mars Rover, Curiosity rover, had landed on the surface of Mars, and the scientists at NASA and JPL decided that they would save its first robotic movements onto the surface of Mars for August 22nd, 2012, to honor Ray Bradbury on what would have been his 92nd birthday. And as the Curiosity rover moved onto that far distant red soil, they deemed that region on Mars Bradbury Landing in honor of him as a birthday present. And something he told me, along with the Mr. Electrico story in that first interview that I did for the Chicago Tribune when I first met him, something he told me when I said, "You've written about reincarnation and the afterlife do you believe? And he said, what I believe is that 200 years from now, when we have colonized Mars, a little boy or a little girl living on the surface of Mars is going to crawl under the bed sheets with a flashlight and read a copy of the Martian Chronicles. Live forever, Ray Bradbury. So thank you all. Appreciate it. I'm happy to move to some questions. I have books here that I'm happy to sign and hang out and talk about writing, but I thought we'd take a little bit of time. As I said today, I teach a 4-hour class on Ray Bradbury. My assistant knows I can talk about Ray Bradbury endlessly. My children are like, Dad, please, the salad has nothing to do with Ray Bradbury. Can you stop? But so I'm happy to keep talking, or you can shut me up. Turn me off like a Bradbury robot when I've gone on too long. Any questions? And I'm a professor, so I will call on people. The shy COD audience. Yes, sir.
I think I read the article in the Sunday Trib.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a while, but
15 years.
There were photographs in there, weren't there?
There were, yes.
The books.
Mm-hmm.
Can you describe his home, his life?
Wow.
Was he a knick-knack? Was he stuff all over the place?
This is a very, very emotional question for me. So I appreciate you asking it. There were photographs. He moved into that house on Thanksgiving Day, 1958. Why they moved in on Thanksgiving Day, I don't know. He couldn't remember what they were thinking. They had 22 cats. So when we talk about crazy cat people, he was one at that time. He said we had 4 and they all got pregnant. He said when they were moving, they had metal trash cans and cats were leaping from them as they were loading them off the moving truck. The first time I arrived, there were cats darting out of the shrubbery. It was, and he lived in that house until he died. He that's the bed where we did these interviews. That's the bed where I read this story. And there were photographs of that house. And he was not a neatnik. He was the early progenitor of hoarding. If there was a 50s version of the popular cable television series Hoarders, Ray Bradbury would have been one of its early reality star participants. He couldn't throw a thing out, nothing. And I remember he had this famous basement office. Basements are a rarity in Los Angeles, because of earthquakes. But he had a basement, and that's where he worked, and all of his stuff was down there. And I remember he was napping. He loved it. He always took a nap. He believed in the recuperative power of the nap. He said, I'm a morning writer, and with a nap, I have 2 mornings. I wake up, I write, I take a nap, and hello, morning. And he would write again. So during those naps, I would go down to this basement, and it was like a child allowed to comb through the Smithsonian of Bradbury, and going through files, like unpublished stories in a filing cabinet. It just keeps coming, And after a decade of doing that, I had torn the poor man's house upside down. As a biographer, you are utterly invasive. So if you're considering of hiring somebody to write your biography, realize that they will come through your tax records. I went through poor Ray Bradbury's underwear and sock drawer. I can answer the Clintonian era question of boxers or briefs as it pertains to Ray Douglas Bradbury. And it is both, as he's this remarkable contradiction, massive contradiction. He wore both. Too much information, but I'm his biographer, so I share that with you. And the reason I was going through the drawers was he had all of his old Hollywood autograph books, Marlene Dietrich, George Burns, Clark Gable, and he said, oh, they're in the underwear drawer. Go ahead, Sam. In his desk drawer, I found rubber bands, little ringlets that would go with braces. Why are these here? So I bring them up, and he's roused from his nap, and he sits in his giant overstuffed Pottery Barn leather chair before his 70-inch flat-screen television. And if you've read Fahrenheit 451, now we're getting into massive contradictions yet again. But he said, I'm not against all TV, I'm just against bad TV. And I'm like, Ray, what are these rubber bands? He's like, let me see those. And he took them in his thick hands and said, and held them to his heart. He said, thank God you found them. And I said, what are these? And he said, those were my daughter Ramona's rubber bands from when she had braces in the 50s. Thank you for finding them. I'll keep them right here with me. He saved everything. And so the house was filled with Everestian piles of papers and story starts, and it was fantastic. I remember once he was in a panic, and he was not a panicky guy. And he said, I've lost a royalty check for Fahrenheit 451. And can you find it? Because it's sizable. You know, a royalty check is something an author gets every 3 months, 6 months, year if you're with Melville House. Maybe not. They haven't paid me completely for this, and I'm on camera yet again. I was scolded earlier. He's panicking. He said, "Can you find this royalty check?" And I'm going through the dining room, which his wife despised because it was just this Matterhorn of milk crates and papers and stuff. And I searched for 5 hours, and I found a check for $250,000 for Fahrenheit 451. And he held it to his chest and said, "Oh, thank God." So he saved everything. I've gone on and on. I appreciate that question. And the reason this is a very emotional question is I spent days and days in that house. And I will tell you with not just a little bit of anger that a buyer just bought that house and tore the damn thing down. And if you look up on the Melville House blog, you can see me wound up and kind of going off. Not happy that the city of Los Angeles and the family, I wish they would have, you know, I think they sold it in the pain of their dad's death, and they didn't think, you know, they never wanted to see their family home torn down. But a very famous architect, what do they call him, a starchitect, purchased the home and has leveled it and is now promised, because of the uproar, to honor Bradbury on the property. But the house is now gone. So that's why I'm a little bit emotional. Yes, sir?
What inspired him to write Fahrenheit 451?
Again, what inspired him to write Fahrenheit 451? And that's largely considered to be his masterpiece, the magnum opus, the 9th best-selling classic in America last year, published in 35 languages around the world, has sold millions and millions of copies globally, is assigned in middle schools and high schools and colleges. And so what prompted him to write that? I talked about this today in the craft workshop I led. And he would often make lists of things he loved and lists of things he hated as writing prompts. And so in the early 1950s, he made a list of things he loved, and on that list were libraries. This is a man, as I said earlier, was completely post-high school educated, reading 3 nights a week in the public library. He graduated from high school. He couldn't go to college. And so he said, "I am not going to fall behind my friends. I am going to go to college myself." And that college is called the public library. And he went 3 nights a week for a decade. And when he got married, he thought, "I don't have time anymore to go to the public library. I now have a wife and I have a writing career now. I've graduated from the public library after a decade of 3 nights a week." So this love of libraries and love of books was on this list of what are the things he loved, books and libraries. So he wanted to write a novel that celebrated that love. And I think for the writers in the room, as I said today, it behooves all of us to rush home right now in a journal or on a piece of paper and make a list of things you love. I put a spin on it for my students and say, what are the things you find are cool? And as I said today, the things on my list are, you know, it's extensive. You know, I love handmade books, book and paper arts, and that is a component in the novel I'm writing. I love the concept of misconnections and fate. I love all sorts of things, and I write about them all the time. I love jazz, and I just wrote a jazz short story this past summer. And so he wrote about books and libraries. But he conversely would make lists of things that infuriated him. And on that list at the same time was Joseph McCarthy and the communist witch hunt throughout Hollywood, destroying the careers of screenwriters who were not communists. But in America, we have the right to our own political leanings and our beliefs. And he believed that they should have the right to pursue their own political leanings, even if you disagree with them. That's speech in this country and freedom. And so he was enraged that screenwriters he knew could no longer get a job because of McCarthy and the witch hunts. He saw during World War II Hitler burning books in the streets of Berlin in old black and white newsreel footage, and was enraged and cried at the sight of pyres and huge towers of books aflame. Joseph Stalin burned books. He knew that the Alexandrian libraries of ancient times had been decimated several times. Today, a library can be burned as we digitize with a click of a mouse. Gone. That's a really frightening prospect if you think about the digital era. And so Bradbury had this list of things he loved and this list of things he hated, and he brought them together and said, I'm going to write a novel about a future society where books no longer exist. He knew that television was rising and it was going to become a terrific distraction to all of us, that technology was going to take us away from this, that the phone and the tablet to come. He didn't know necessarily that those things would come, but he knew technology, the arrival of mass media was here, and that it was going to distract us from this. He knew it. And so he brought all of this to the UCLA library. He couldn't afford an office, and so he wrote Fahrenheit 451 in a typewriter room in the basement of the UCLA library on a rental typewriter, a dime a half hour. And for $9.80 in 9 days, he wrote Fahrenheit 451. And all those years later, that $9.80 turned into that $250,000 check I found and much more. So it was a pretty good investment. But that's the story behind Fahrenheit. Maybe one or two more questions, and we'll move to book signing. Yes, sir.
That might be considered one of his greatest works. What's your favorite?
Oh, that's great. So what's my favorite? I love that book, and I love the way it reads. He said, you know what's deceiving about Fahrenheit? Because it's considered literature. But he said, you know what? It's really just a fugitive chase. It's a fireman who burns books for a living, and one day sees that people are willing to die for their books. Like, if you're going to come into my home and burn my book collection, burn me with it. And he's startled by that. And so he decides to take one of the books home with him and read it, and starts to discover what it is that people love. And when the rest of the firemen discover that Montag is reading, he goes on the run. And that happens pretty quick in the book. And he would say that Fahrenheit 451 is just Harrison Ford in The Fugitive. It's like, I never knew I was writing literature. I thought I was writing an adventure novel. That book is not necessarily my favorite. I think it's a classic. I think it's very challenging in its themes. But I would say my favorite books, to your questions, are the Martian Chronicles, which is a collection of short stories that shouldn't daunt any of you if you're nervous about science fiction, because it's a mirror on contemporary society. It's about what happens when we go to Mars and we bring with us racism, environmental destruction. We start naming all of the mountains and bluffs after corporations. He wrote this in late 1940s. It's a remarkable book. We decimate the Martian people the way we decimated the native cultures here. It's absolutely a metaphor for Western expansionism and the frontier myth. It's a remarkable book. And there's a comedy story in there. There's frightening stories in there. There's horror. There's one of his classics, There Will Come Soft Rains, about a house back on Earth that continues to survive after the nuclear bomb has gone off and the house is all alone and all the people are gone. Remarkable story. So I would say the Martian Chronicles. And if I can cheat, though, and really go on a limb, I would say, and his wife agreed with me on this, so 56 years of marriage, she said, look, all this stuff this guy does, designing shopping plazas and doing plays, she goes, just forget about it. Now, she was a great character. She said he should stick with the short story. That's his strength. So if you're going to go out and get only one book, I would go get a book called The Stories of Ray Bradbury. And there are two of them. This one is called The Stories of Ray Bradbury, and it's 100 of his best stories. Includes the Foghorn, which I mentioned earlier. He wrote so much that they were able to do another best of called Bradbury Stories with another 100. I am recommending to you the first one, The Stories of Ray Bradbury. There's a beautiful edition published by Modern Library. And I'm going against my own interests here because he dedicated the second book in part to me. But I'm still recommending the first one as the finest book he's done, and it's 100 of his best stories. Go get it. Get a used copy, and it will absolutely stun you. I give that as gifts all the time. One more? Yes?
Of each of his books, how many did he have in his house? Like Fahrenheit 451, how many did he have? Foghorn, how many did he have?
Oh, how many separate copies of each edition? Well, it varied, you know. In his garage, he stored copies of all of his books because he would go to book signings and bring a bookseller with him, and they would sell books. So there were literally hundreds of copies of Fahrenheit and Martian Chronicles. It really, really varied. You know, I would say some of the rare first editions, he only had one copy of them. I remember once at a signing, somebody came up with a first edition of R is for Rocket, S is for Space, a great sort of YA collection of his short fiction, his short stories that are appropriate for YA readers. And it was a first edition of both of these books, covered in that clear acetate to protect it. They were in mint condition. And the person came up and said, "Mr. Bradbury, will you sign my first editions?" And he looked at them, and I knew right then, like, oh God. I'm standing there, and he stares at them for an elongated period of time. And he said, "Thank you." And he put them in his canvas bag. And the person's standing there at the table with a marker waiting for them to be signed and doesn't know what to say. Ray Bradbury's just taken their first edition mint copy of these two books that you buy on eBay for hundreds and hundreds of dollars, and he just put them in a little canvas tote. And I'm like, okay, this is going to be fascinating. What is this person going to say? So, Mr. Bradbury, I wanted you to sign those. I felt terrible. And so I interject. I said, "Ray, those were his books. He wants you to sign them. You shouldn't take them, you know?" He's like, "But I don't have copies of those." So he said, "Young man, give me your address, and I will send you a goodie bag that will blow your mind." And he's like, "Really?" So Bradbury sent copies of literally, not first editions, but signed editions of every one of his books to this guy in a massive box. So it was kind of a fair trade-off. But I saw him do this a lot. So there were some books he didn't have. You know, he was a very generous guy, and he gave things to people who came in his house all the time. So I've talked on and on. I appreciate your enthusiasm and interest in his life. I have a blog, listentotheechoes.com, that is strictly dedicated to Bradbury. Currently, I have a series called The Essential Bradbury, where I'm musing on what I deem the 25 essential stories that you must read and why. I'm currently blogging on the house and photographs from my own collection, trying to pay tribute to the house now that it's been decimated. I can talk about Ray Bradbury endlessly, so I encourage you, if you're interested further, to go to the blog. I'm also on Twitter, and I'll shamelessly promote my Twitter handle, and it's just Sam. This drives me crazy because somebody in England got my name. So it's Sam__Weller, but if you search me, you'll see me pop up. And I tweet about Bradbury every day, all day long. What I learned from him, his life lessons, his philosophies. And so I'm pretty active on that. And if you engage me on Twitter, I will follow you back. You'll pick up a follower. What price is that? So I thank you all from the bottom of my heart. Ray is here in spirit, and he thanks you and says to you, live forever. Thank you.